Okay, so welcome everyone to Rebuilding Me 101, our Facebook group. And as always, I get so encouraged when I look out and I see all you guys and I see the progress that you're making, and it's so good to have you with us. This subject that we're going to talk about tonight, I'm absolutely enamored with and fascinated by, and it is applicable to people that are not even doing keto. And I'll tell you why, because we are going to talk about what the medical field has jumped on. They see the keto craze and they know everybody's anti-carb. So they have got what they call carb blockers. You can buy it in a pill form, you can drink it, and you can do other things with it. Is it bad? I'm not going to go too far into that, but I will say this: it is based on natural things that are found in the soil as well as in different plants. So our job tonight is to talk about how we can access them without buying pills and getting the side effects, which I'll just briefly mention to get you all excited. You could have bloating, gas, diarrhea, and lots of other fun things when you go to the bathroom. So if you can do it naturally, as you can see, much better approach. And it's the way we were created. It was the way we were designed to work in conjunction with the soil and even the foods. Ironically, I'll just give you this as a quick one of the things that are even found in grains and cereals, which should help you block themselves, or the high peaks of insulin and so forth. So that's just a little preview of what we're going to get into. So let's talk about 5 things that we can do that help us slow down and sometimes block, hide, diminish, or reduce the processing in our digestive system of carbohydrates. Why do we want to do that? Carbohydrates not our enemy. We are in ketosis, so we limit our carbs. And a post that is probably going up on the feed right now is it got a lot of the good carbs, which we would find them from cruciferous vegetables, leafy vegetables, other high vegetables, high in phytonutrients, enzymes, and other things that we need besides the proteins and the fats that we eat. So that being said, why do we want to minimize the carb impact? In fact, let's use a medical term, the glycemic load. We're not talking about the glycemic index, which is a way of measuring those loads, but the load is more important than the glycemic index. Why? Because in just simple terms, it's the impact or the punch that the carbohydrates turned into sugar hits your bloodstream with. What is the result in the bloodstream of high carbohydrates or sugar? What dragon comes out, as I like to call them? You've heard many times, those of you who've heard my talks. Insulin. Insulin is the enzyme, it is the hormone, I should say, that is necessary to break down carbohydrates. If you eat carbohydrates, your body, your pancreas must secrete the hormone insulin in order to deal with it. When insulin is present, what does it do to the fat cells and the sugar in your blood? Immediately opens up all the jail cells of the fat cells that we have. And if you don't have enough, it'll make more for you. It's happy to add to your hips, your belly, your buttocks, and everywhere else where it can put a fat cell and then stuff that sugar in there. And it won't come out again. Now, here's the calories in, calorie out. We know that's not true. Just a quick review for some of the new folks. It will not open up that fat again until the insulin drops. So we say that all the time. That's why insulin, we don't want to call it the enemy, but I do call it the dragon. Sometimes we want the dragon, but when that insulin comes out, you are not going to burn fat. It's going to empty your liver from sugar. It's going to empty your bloodstream. You'll be starving by the time you get those fat cells out, unless you're keto adaptive already, and then you can make the transition and burn fat. Okay, that's the quick up to speed why we should even care about blocking the carbs. For some of you, this was just a quick review, but it's always good to review, isn't it? So here, let's get right into how do we understand a number of places on the digestive tract. If we look at it as a conveyor system, the digestive tract as a conveyor system, from the minute it hits our mouth and we get the digestion or the ingestion, then the digestion, and then we get the, of course, elimination. But in the process, there's 26 feet of intestines, and there's a bunch of blocks stops, even doorways where the food will have to stop, and other things like the villi in your intestines that is trying to grab all those enzymes. So there's all these places where it's going to process the food. If we understand some of those places, we can understand how to slow the glycemic load, the punch of that sugar, so that we don't get that insulin spike and we don't start the weight gain. So let's start with the first place. In fact, I think I'm gonna try this screen share again. I always have trepidation when I try this, but let's see if we can do it. Okay, so let's do this one. Let's look at this. This is our first place that we're looking at. What are we looking at? We are looking at the stomach. That big blue balloon is your stomach. And of course, that little pink tube on top of it is your esophagus. Of course, that's attached to your mouth. What happens is when you start to chew or masticate the food, you are now beginning what we'll call on our assembly line, the grinder. What happens is you start producing enzymes that send signals to your whole body to now prepare for what's coming. In fact, let me see if I can show this. Let's go here. You see the mouth up there? We got food in it. Depending on the size that you chew food will determine how quickly it can be processed. That's a no-brainer, right? But now, how does that principle, if you apply that to some of the food that is out there in the SAD diet, become very important? Well, here's how. Sometimes we're eating food that has already been chewed. We haven't even had an opportunity to chew it because we're drinking a protein shake. We're drinking something that we put in a blender. So there's no mastication. There's no enzymes on the tongue, no amylase, this enzyme that's going to grab onto that food. And when it gets to the stomach, it's going to send a signal to hormones that you need. So look at the guy's mouth and look at this conveyor system that ends up in the elimination, as we said, and remind yourself there's 26 feet in that tubing. So now you take a swallow of your favorite protein shake or your liquid food, no mastication, right down the steep roller coaster, the steepest roller coaster in the world, right? Even bigger than that one you all got up in Ohio, I think. Right, Judy? And then it hits that balloon of the stomach. Now just do the physics, okay? There's a little valve that in the esophagus that makes sure it goes to the stomach, but that's going to splash up against the back wall of the stomach. All turbulence is going to take place, and it's going to go to, you see where that purple line starts? That's your small intestine, and there's a valve in there, kind of acts like, it's a little sphincter. It's called the pyloric sphincter. And what happens is that will reduce itself and sometimes regulate how much it lets out. But if you drank your food and didn't chew it, went right past that, hit the stomach, goes past the valve, never has a signal that it should be closing or that you're getting full, goes right into the small intestines, and whatever you ate, drank is completely without fiber, without anything to mask it. Its glycemic load, even if it's not sugar and it's just protein, it will be absorbed through the villi, through that small intestine, the large intestine, so quickly that your pancreas, your beta cells, your insulin will go into havoc trying to process this food that came out of nowhere. Now, let's do the opposite. Suppose you chew the food, and the food that you put in your mouth is of a whole grain or whole food nature. Now, even if you were eating grains and carbohydrates the way we would back in biblical times, let's say, now you've got the endosperm, you've got the hull, you've got it in the more natural form. Now it's going down slower, and those things are going to be harder to digest. So they're going to stay in the stomach a little bit longer. In fact, let's go over to here. You can see I got numbers memorized, and that's what we're going with. Okay, so there's the food, and you see the juices coming out of the stomach wall. Here's a question. Does your stomach assimilate or absorb the nutrients in the food? Is that where that takes place? What do you think? You're absolutely right. I see some head shaking. All that does, that's the hopper, or let's call it a storage bin if you don't know what a hopper is. That's where it's being held while the juices turn it into what we call a bolus, which is basically a big goopy ball so that it can be prepped to go into that purple small intestine you see on the end. And that's a better view of the connection where that pyloric valve is. It's going to pick up information from the enzymes that because you chewed your food, and then the digestive juices to tell it how much can go through at a time. So it can do this for you. It can become the thing that slows the process down. And not only does that help you suppress the insulin spike, but you will begin to feel full sooner. Now, here's a question. If you go out to eat or you're eating a dinner and all of a sudden, because of the way you're processing the food, you're beginning to feel full way before that protein shake that went flying by on the highway already. And now all of a sudden, see, you will not eat as much. So because of the way you're eating and what you're eating, you are not eating as much. In fact, controlling that pyloric valve using what we're describing has the same effect of when doctors do an operation and they put the bands around you. So you're trying to fool the stomach. You're making the stomach seem smaller because you wrap it with rubber bands so that the message is, hey, we're full down here. Let's slow it up there. So now you can, what you eat, when you eat it, and how you digest it, or I should say ingest it, can now determine whether or not this goes at an insulin spike and the sugar hits you hard and you come out of ketosis or not. Let's go back to, here's an interesting fact. Let's go back to the chewing, the mastication. If you do eat pasta and you have it al dente, guess what? You just helped the stomach slow down the eating process. Because it's firm, it takes longer to digest. That bolus that they're trying to make will take a little bit longer, so it will stay in the stomach longer. So al dente pasta, I'm not promoting eating pasta, although don't tell anybody, I'll do it once in a while. But if you do, you can have it al dente, and that will help you in your digestion. Now, the same principle applies if you were eating bread. If you eat the middle of that soft Italian bread and you just start, devouring it, it's so soft, so warm. I got to stop or I'll tempt us all to go hit the bakery. What do you think is easier to digest, toasted bread or that soft, mushy bread? Which do you think the bolus is it's gonna take longer to turn into the bolus, the toasted bread? So even something as little of that as that can make a difference, you see? So let's go into a little bit more into this control valve and the pyloric sphincter, as we call it. I'm going to read this from you from these doctors here, one of my favorite books. The most potent stimulator in your pyloric valve is the presence of fat in your intestine. If you're on keto, are you eating fat? Of course, right? Now listen to this. As soon as fat passes through, see that little purple valve where it touches the blue balloon on the screen? As soon as fat goes through there, it activates a reflex that closes the pyloric valve. So now that little valve is starting to shrink, which keeps food from exiting the stomach. It doesn't take much fat to do this. Scientists have found that as little as 2 teaspoons of fat before a meal will slow the stomach from emptying. Now, here's a question. 2 teaspoons of a fat. Do you know of a fat that will fit very nicely in 2 teaspoons in a liquid form even? What are you thinking of? Are you thinking of olive oil? So wait a minute. Are we saying that if before I eat the meal, I do what they do in the Mediterranean and I have a salad with almost no calories and leafy vegetables and lots of fiber, which we're going to talk about has a huge effect too, but it also has 2 tablespoons or teaspoons of fat. Before my meal comes, I just hacked the system. You see, you just had some fat that told that pyloric valve to send the message that we're getting full, and it will start to close it. Now, here's another point. Do you know of any cultures that might serve a cheese plate or some nuts before a meal? Can you think of any cultures that do that? Aubrey and I have visited a country that does that, right, sweetie? So I'm sure there's many cultures that you can think of. Well, that's the same thing. If you have a little bit of cheese, maybe you're on your way to a restaurant or a friend's house and you don't know what they're going to give you. A couple of pieces of cheese, enough to get some fat going, even nuts. And I think Vicky is very happy to hear about that. She can eat nuts before her meal, right? So now you have permission, Vicky, but not too much. So then here's the point, 10 or 15 minutes before the meal, that's how long it'll take to get there if you're taking the cheese or the nuts. So you want to get that before your entree comes, or you get to the restaurant or the friend's house. When you sit down to eat, you will still have plenty of room in your stomach to enjoy your meal. However, because the tightened pyloric valve slows the passage of food out of your stomach, it takes less food to fill you up. Isn't that nice? So we're not hungry. It took less food because we worked with the message. Remember, we gave a talk and we said the only way we can communicate with the master chemistry of our body is by what touches our mouth. Remember that talk not too long ago? So now by sending that down first, we sent the message. We controlled our appetite. See, we made the hormones work for us, not the appetite suppressant centers that are flooded with amino acids and they're not communicating properly. We activated the hormones that we wanted to send the message to. So how beautiful is that? Isn't that cool? I just love that. I just kind of geek out on that. But surgeons use this principle, like we said, to perform the weight loss surgery. So let's do a little quick review of that. Eating a fatty snack 10 or 15 minutes before a meal, taking either fish oil supplements or olive oil 10, 15 minutes before the meal, or if we don't, just take the teaspoon or the shot of vinegar and we want to have it in a nice packaging like salad, that's a good way to do it. So moral of the story, do it I want to say ancestors, but our great grandmas and grandpas knew before we did. Have a salad before the meal. Make sure it has some oil and vinegar. You can have some of the other stuff, like if it's not sugary, you can have your blue cheese. That's another great way, right? But just make sure you're getting a bit of oil and some vinegar. Now, the vinegar is a little separate thing that I want to talk about. Let's call this the disassembler on our assembly line before I get to and this will help us introduce the vinegar. Your intestinal cells can absorb starch. They cannot do it unless they are broken down into individual glucose. Remember we said that starch last week was our talk, and that it's technically a complex sugar. It's a form of sugar. It's a carbohydrate, which is a sugar, but their linkage, the molecules are linked in such a way that they're not in a single molecule. So in order to break that down, there's something that we need in our system, and it's called amylase. This is one of the things they put in those pills we were talking about. And basically it comes from the soil. You can find this naturally in soil where the plants are grown. But if you have this in your diet, in your intestines, it will use this amylase, I should say, is the enzyme that wants to break it down. And the vinegar is what inhibits the amylase. Let me retract my last two sentences. Amylase is the enzyme that breaks this down, and the pills are designed to block that. But vinegar, just general vinegar, will block the amylase. You can't see it. See, it's a disruptor. It doesn't let the amylase find the carbohydrates, or at least a lot of it. So what are you putting in your salad? You got a double hit of not only the fat, but the vinegar. So not only are you telling your pyloric valve that you're full, but the vinegar is blocking the enzyme, the amylase, from finding all the carbs. It's distracting it. So how cool is that, right? So those are just some of the blocks. So let's talk a little bit more about, we already said these Mediterranean countries already know that. And this is why, like last week, in fact, I think Frank just joined us. He asked a great question. You might remember in a support group. So why are these countries that have rice and they have carbohydrates and they have all these things, how come they can eat these carbs? Well, these things that we just talked about, especially this one here, the vinegar, having the salad with the oil, sending the message to the pyloric valve, and then the vinegar blocking the high carb concentration. See, that's how we used to eat. And the grains were more fuller, so they had one of the last things we're going to talk about, which is the fiber. Fiber is like a giant sponge that absorbs many of these enzymes as well, like amylase, and it doesn't allow it to process these simple carbs as quickly because it reduces the flood of them in the intestine. So these are just some of the ways. The fiber is nature's most powerful carb blocker. In fact, 10 grams of fiber can reduce after meal blood glucose levels by as much as 20%. And you see the connection, what happened in 1975 when so many of the countries that were eating the carbs, everything was more refined, as we had discussed in previous talks. Now that they had massive refining of grains and carbohydrates, many of even in the China study, they were no longer just eating the rice with a lot of the grain with it. So they were losing the fiber, which was blocking potentially and soaking up the amylase and so many of this. I know we're rushing through this, but I'm trying to keep this close to, whoa, man, we're already over time. So quick review. Here's the 5 things. The grinder, the way we chew the food and the size that we put in. Don't do shakes, don't drink your food. The hopper, the belly, we want it to stay in there longer. So we control the sphincter, the pyloric sphincter, which is the control valve. And then, of course, we talked about what we just went into, the vinegar, the oil, the fats, and the dissembler of the amylase to block that enzyme. So why is that important to us? Because if we are even eating our vegetables, like the cruciferous vegetables, and sometimes we get worried we get close to that 20 grams, we want to make sure we stay under it. If you're doing this, you could be significantly blocking a lot of the carbohydrate and the insulin spike. So, well, let me see. I left that whole video up there. Okay, we'll stop the share. And so you guys got to look at a stomach instead of me all that time. That was I know I did you all a favor, right? So let's stop the recording and then we can chat about this, okay?